Today, we are honored to have Jared Hamilton. He is a senior manager based in Indianapolis at Crowe Horwath and currently leads Crowe's healthcare cybersecurity consulting practice with a specialized focus in cybersecurity, information security program implementation, penetration testing, and cloud security. Jared's past experience spans clients from multiple industries, delivery of cybersecurity solutions, as well as serving as the Information Security Officer for a Midwest healthcare provider. We are honored to have Jared today, and at this point, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa, for that introduction, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. I'm delighted to speak with you all today on a topic that is close to all of us, both in our professional and personal lives as well. So obviously a topic that continues to get more and more attention. I've been in the IT security or cybersecurity world, as it's now referred to, kind of an all-encompassing title for the IT security world, is cybersecurity now, and very familiar with the challenges that brings many industries. My background started in the financial services sector, and is now I am wholly focused just in the healthcare industry, where I think there are many unique challenges in the cybersecurity world specific to healthcare, and limitations in some ways of how controls can be implemented and in what's a 24/7 type environment for most folks. And you know, a lot of times I think we treat patients really well, but we don't always necessarily take care of the back-end data that we collect on those patients, and it can put them at risk even after they leave our facilities. So I think it's a great topic. It's great to have focus specifically in the healthcare world as well, and relate this topic hopefully to your day-to-day environments and what everyone on the webinar here deals with from that perspective. I would like to say, you know, if anyone would like me to touch base with them after the webinar with any particular questions, there will be a chance for Q&A at the end of this, and I'd be happy to answer things there. But if you'd like some personal attention on specific needs you may have, or have other questions you may not want to share with the whole group, I'd be happy to reach back out to you afterwards. Just provide your email in the comment box, and we'll capture that, and I'll get back to you later this week. So as we get started, just want to make sure that we all understand this is educational nature, and that the topics can change. So the legal department always likes me to share that before we get going too far. And what we plan on covering today in the agenda is first defining cybersecurity. I think for a lot of folks this is a very intimidating topic. It's a very confusing topic, and it's certainly very frustrating for those that have had compliance issues or have had a breach or some type of incident that they've had to respond to. At the very least, just the confusion that surrounds this very topic. I'd like to start out the webinar by you know, putting some definition behind it, so that you can at least walk away with kind of having a firmer grasp on, you know, what is this topic really, and what can you do about it. I then like to transition to talk to, you know, some of the top threats and responses, again, specific to healthcare. A lot of these resonate outside of healthcare, but there's certainly some healthcare specific threats that I would like to talk through and kind of give you the top 5 ones that we've seen. These aren't going to be things, you know, just the top 5 things that you see in the media, but it's really derived from the results of the assessment work that I do week in, week out with clients, and talking about the top threats and challenges they have, and responding to those threats to help mitigate them. So we'll walk through those. I always like to address compliance versus security as well. You'll hear me talk today, and I'm sure everyone on the phone is very familiar with HIPAA. And the privacy and security regulations around HIPAA, and what needs to be done, whether you're a covered entity or a business associate. Obviously, there are certain compliance expectations are out there, but how does that relate to security? You know, are those two different things? Are they the same, or where do they overlap? A lot of clients ask me that question, so I'd like to address my views on compliance versus security. And then finally, I'd like to arm you with data and really an approach that you can use to take action if you're in a position where you can make a difference for your institution, or if you can influence those that can take action in other areas. with people that you manage. I want to give you a what I consider a fairly simple action plan, something that you can walk away today to at least understand how you can assess and identify the top risks and put a strategic plan in place to address those risks in your environment. So we'll do that, and then obviously we'll have time for questions at the end. So I'd like to start out and just provide a simple picture of what I thought the cybersecurity world looked like in 1998. At the time, it was just puppy dog type nature. It was something that, there were a lot of, script kiddies and various things out there that people could take advantage to, cause disruption a little bit, change a picture on your web page, do various things that didn't necessarily have a huge impact on your operations or your data, but would be kind of cute, but sometimes frustrating, just like a new puppy would be. It's cute, maybe it makes a mess here or there as you train this puppy, but it's nothing that you can't, quickly clean up and kind of move on to the next thing. So it wasn't anything that anyone took, real seriously at the time. But today, it's a very different beast. The IT security world today, these cyber crooks have grown up. Those puppies have turned into ferocious beasts, right? So we have, nation state actors that from, other governments are attacking us. We have competitors that want to understand our intellectual property to gain insights into our data, since everything is electronic now and everything's transmitted electronically. Online interaction, collaboration, we're dealing with patients and telemedicine remotely. There's so many ways that we can be affected by any disruption in this technology or loss of data, and the compliance expectations and the fines that we're seeing from OCR now in dealing with HIPAA compliance, and the teeth of that regulation have really begun to sunk in for many people, and it's become obviously a much more difficult issue to deal with in today's world. The cyber crooks have grown up as well. They're no longer script kiddies. They have become true enterprises, to where you can actually go on the dark web and purchase, ransomware, or you can subscribe to a denial of service assault that you can target at another organization. So it's not just a world where, elite hackers have the skill set to cause harm, but it's anyone with some motivation, some know-how, and perhaps a little bit of funding that they can acquire that skill set and direct it at a target. So it's very important that we understand the risks and that we have resiliency when there is an event that happens. And I always talk to folks about how it's not if something will happen, but when is it going to happen to you? And maybe some folks on this call have had, experiences with breaches or loss of data and had to deal with that. And being able to be resilient and work through that situation, recover from that situation, and move on is really the key today. Not just defending it, but being able to react to it. So, Solution Showcase. This was taken at the Solution Showcase. It was a picture I took at the Gartner Risk and Compliance Conference last year. And I remember I went down the escalator, walked into the Solution Showcase area, and there's this giant banner. This was probably 12 feet high by 15 feet wide. And it just struck me as, wow, look at all the different technology vendors that are in this space now. We have some names we recognize, but we have many names that carry kind of sexy, CyberArk and, Bitdefender, these cool names that kind of stick out to draw your attention. And there's just so many of them. Some of these you can't even see the print that they're so small. And, I think it's, on one hand, I have two thoughts on this. On one hand, it's exciting how, over the years, how many new technologies have come out, some really cool things that have come out to help deal with this new cybersecurity risk. But the invert of that is the confusion it creates in the marketplace. And by the marketplace, I mean, the folks just like you that are on the phone. What do all these things do? Why are there so many? Which is the one that I need to buy to fix my problem? You may ask that, or how much do these cost? And, which one best fits in my environment, or are there a couple that I need to buy? What is my takeaway from this? And it's just very confusing, and I think there's a lot of marketing efforts that go into these companies and pushing their ideas out, and a lot of them do have really cool features, but they don't necessarily address cybersecurity in the sense that it's a people, process, and technology issue. And you can have the greatest technology, you can have unlimited budget to buy as many of these tools and solutions as possible, but if you have a breakdown in a simple process such as terminating or deleting or removing access from a user account on an employee when they're terminated. If there's a breakdown between 8 departments and HR and IT and how that all is coordinated, it's something as simple as that, where a user account gets left open, or a vendor account, or maybe there's a shared service account that someone uses, and something as simple as that can let a bad guy in. It could be a default password or a weak password that gets set up in testing and never changed when things go into production. And of course, people risks as well. There could be a breakdown in how someone easily gets fooled into providing information in a phone call or an email in a phishing attack and gives information out that way. So technology isn't going to solve the solution. It's certainly going to be part of the solution, but it's not everything. And I think all these vendors have kind of put that name out there that you can solve everything with a technology solution, but it's really just one part of an overall problem. So that leads me to, what is cybersecurity? What is this topic that we're talking about? Well, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, or NIST, refers to this as the ability to protect or defend the use of cyberspace from cyber attacks. Basically what they're saying here is, you're being targeted, from outside your institution. You're being targeted primarily over the public internet. There could be other ways. It could be through vendors, which we'll talk about. It could be through your people. It could be a USB key that's left in the employee parking lot that someone picks up and brings in. But primarily it's your internet-facing services. And as those continue to increase, as more patient portals are pushed out and mobile applications that we interface with our patients with, there's going to be more ability, more bandwidth, and opportunity for bad guys to attack your data, to put it at risk, to compromise, as well as shut down services that we all depend on. So that's what we're trying to defend from. And there's also this theory of the triad of security, or the CIA of critical data. And what this is referring to is, there's a lot of focus on confidentiality. Of course, we have to keep, patient records private, and there's a lot of PII as well, patient or personally identifiable information. So you got personal information, you got healthcare information, you probably have billing information, perhaps you have research data or intellectual property. So there's a lot of focus on the confidentiality of that, making sure we keep that only open to eyes that should see it. But there's more to security than that. There's also integrity and availability. We need to make sure that the data is correct. So you may have pieces of data that you're not real concerned about the confidentiality of it, but you're concerned that it's completely accurate. Or you're concerned that that data is available when you need it. So it may be public data, but is it the right data, and is it available when you need it? And you see things such as denial of service attacks that don't expose data, but they shut down services and cease operations and causes a disruption in the availability, and that's part of the security or cybersecurity world as well. Of course, this affects everyone, anyone at a personal level, organization level that's connected or uses the internet, so that's everyone anymore. And as I talked to before, there's 3 types of controls that need to be applied to address cybersecurity. As I mentioned before, the people controls, making sure people are educated and have security awareness with the data that they utilize and the technology they use that data with, the processes that are in place so there's not breakdown there, and then of course technology as well, making sure that we have good technical controls in place, and not just firewalls, but all kinds of other logging and monitoring and technology-driven security solutions that are out there. Next, let's talk about the trends a little bit. So, as I mentioned, this has been an evolving risk, but what are the trends that we've seen over time? So, the illustration you see here is from the 2016 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. In fact, the 2017 report just came out the other week, and it's a great read, by the way. If you have any, detailed interest in in breaches and cybersecurity in general, and how things happen, and what everyone else is experiencing as compared to yourself, it's a great resource to look at. But from last year's report, some of the things that struck out to me is asking, who is attacking me? Who are these people? Is it people from the inside the organization? Because it certainly can be. And a lot of times those are the ones that we see the most. If you're a smaller organization and you have a small IT department or one computer person that handles everything, how do you protect from that insider threat? At some point there's going to be some employee that has, full access or the keys to your kingdom, if you will. But the data shows that 80% of all breaches are really due to external attackers. So people coming and attacking from the outside, trying to gain access to your data or cause disruption. And what's their motivation is the second question. I think this is pretty interesting as well. 80% is for financial gain. I guess that makes sense, right? Everyone's looking to make a buck, and as I mentioned before, things, it doesn't take an elite person anymore. Sometimes you just gotta have some funding to, reach out to those services and buy the services to do it. But ultimately they're looking to, sell those records, sell that personal information to others and make money that way. 15% espionage, and then just 5% everything else, even grudge or corporate espionage that falls into that. So, and the graph, it sticks out, what are the avenues that people are using? Well, traditional hacking still leads the pack. So this is most likely going to be, targeted technical breakdowns in your controls. You have too many firewall ports open, you have too many internet-facing services that aren't properly configured and allows a bad guy to leverage those configurations or missing patches to exploit a vulnerability and gain access that way. So that still leads the pack. Number two, which we've seen a big rise in over time, is malware. So the spread of malware primarily through email, but it could be through USB, it could be through CDs, although we don't usually use those anymore. Downloading from malicious sites that we get redirected to. Variety of ways that malware can get into your system or your network. And the most recent impact of this is ransomware, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later on. The third biggest one is social aspects. This is the social engineering. This is the phishing attacks and telephone calls and manipulating of people to get access or data that they shouldn't have. So that is something we've seen kind of rise from the pack. So those are the big focuses: preventing the technical attacks, minimizing malware, and making sure employees and vendors have broad security awareness to prevent those social engineering-based attacks. Another big question people talk about is, how did these breaches even happen? The technical breaches, that part of the graph that was leading the pack was those technical breaches. Well, with any outside to inside technical hacking attempt, the first step is that there's always that initial point of entry. And this represents how an attacker initially gains access. There has to be an initial way in before all these other steps can happen. And all these steps together really kind of go together, just like an airliner crash. You hear about, kind of that snowball of things that happen that bring an airliner down. It's not just one lapse or one error, it's multiple breakdowns to actually bring a plane down. There's a lot of redundant systems, and in a cybersecurity hack, there's a lot of redundant systems as well. So it's usually multiple breakdowns at different levels that ultimately lead to that breach. But it all starts with that initial point of entry. So there's that initial, weak password or unpatched system that an attacker gets initial access to an internal system from the outside. And from that from that step, pivoting is what happens. That's what's it's referred to as. So you gain access to, say, a single server or a single workstation or a single web application that you host in your data center. So an attacker may get access to this, and there may be nothing significant on this particular system. There may be no data at all, but it's that initial point of entry that they can use to then pivot to something else. So you think about it, like a house with many doors. If you wanted to rob that house, you have to get initial access into the house, and maybe it's an upstairs bedroom window. And once the attacker gets in that bedroom window, what are they going to do next? Well, maybe there's nothing important. It's a guest room and nothing's in there. Well, they're going to start searching the rest of the house. They're going to go room to room looking for valuables that may be out there. And that's exactly what an electronic attacker does as well. They're going to go system to system, network to network, searching out where that data is at that they're after. And then from that point, they're going to fortify their access. They're going to unlock some other windows in that house. They're going to unlock the back door. They're going to allow themselves other ways to get in case that initial point of entry gets closed. They'll continue to sustain their access by opening and unlocking other doors and windows, and this would, electronic world, mean putting in other agents on other machines, creating back doors back to that attacker. So they're going to fortify their access, and then they're going to basically figure out where your key systems are. So let's say you have an EHR system, they're going to find that. They're going to find your financial system. They're going to find your other patient record systems, all kinds of things, whatever they're after. They're going to start harvesting that information, and ultimately they're going to look to that final step of data exfiltration. They're going to look for pathways to pull that data back out. So they're going to back that truck into the driveway and start loading it up with all that data and to get that data out of there. But they're going to try to do this quietly because usually this is not all done in a day. This is done over a period of time. Attackers have the advantage of being able to go very slow and be able to cover their tracks as they go, try to delete log files and make sure that there's no trail of their access. But they're not always all that thorough. In fact, I think many breaches, from my experience, the attackers don't care about covering their tracks at all. For the most time, they're coming from anonymous sources, and it's very hard to track them back. So they're worried about just mainly, fortifying that access and continuing to retrieve data in an undetected manner. So these 4 steps are the key steps that take place when breaches do happen. So who's attacking us, and who are the different actors involved in the threats that we see on a day-to-day basis? Well, we know most people are financially motivated, so it's your typical, criminal in the light green issued there. I mentioned the insider, an internal employee or vendor that already has access to something. I think that's what makes it one of the harder threats to defend is someone that already has a certain level of access to your network or data systems. They already, day to day, they always have that initial point of entry. What else do they have access to? Espionage, I don't think applies in the healthcare world as much, perhaps from a research perspective, but many more so for manufacturers that are hiding, the secret sauce to the product that they make. Hacktivism is another big one. You may think, we have very good controls, or maybe we're a smaller provider in a rural area of Tennessee, and we're not a big target. We're not one of the big health systems, but you could be. Maybe your CEO has a blog post or is in the news or the media about certain political motivations or theories that they have that the hacktivism community disagrees with. You could very quickly become a target of hacktivism, where they want to attack you purely because of your political motivations and beliefs. And then, of course, terrorism and warfare as well are other threat actors that we all need to be aware of. So this takes us to our first polling question, and again, you need to interact with us for that CPE credit that we all want. So I'll stop there as we work our way through poll question number 1.
So as Jared mentioned, just a reminder for those of you obtaining CPE certification today, you must Respond to at least 2/3 of the polling questions. Our first question, if your organization was hacked or breached, would you know it? Yes, we definitely would know it. We would most likely identify it. If it was a non-sophisticated attack, we would recognize it, or I have no idea. I'll wait just another few seconds. Looks like everyone at this point has voted. So I'm going to close that poll and share the results. Jared, 30% say they would definitely know it. 43% say they would most likely identify it. 13, if it was a non-sophisticated attack, they would recognize it. And 13% have no idea.
Okay, great. Well, that's good. Looks like we got some confidence out there that you would definitely know the breach, and that's great. The next step is being able to respond to it, right? Asking yourself, okay, we've identified it. This is an event that's happened. What's our next move? Have you thought through, who you're going to work with? Have you thought through the legal ramifications or how you're going to communicate, this breach to the outside world? So those are some things to think of if you fell into that 30%, or, you most likely identify it, and I think that's where most people generally fall into. I think if it's something really obvious like a website defacement, you're going to see that. But it's, it's the more sophisticated attacks that certainly it's going to be harder to pick up. And unfortunately, those could be the most brutal as well, have the greatest impact when they're sophisticated, they're targeted, and they're going to be much more long-term in nature and potentially bring out more data than a much smaller or quick and dirty, very very noisy type attack that's easily identified there. So very good. Well, let's move on to the top 5 healthcare cybersecurity threats, and number 1, hands down, without question, is going to be ransomware. Every week, literally, I hear or work with a new client that has had this happen and had to pay or had to restore all their data or came very close to falling victim to ransomware. So it's certainly something that is rampant everywhere. You could get this at home. It's not targeted just to healthcare, although I think it impacts healthcare maybe the hardest. And for those on the phone that don't know what ransomware is, essentially what it is a piece of malware that can get installed on a workstation or a server or even a mobile device. And what it does, as soon as it gets installed, it's going to encrypt that machine. So all the local data, and in some cases now your network data as well. So let's just assume you're using a standard workstation, you have the local C drive, right? Or you have data files saved on your desktop, and maybe you have a map drive and it's called the H drive, and that's where you store all your data. All of that data would become encrypted, and it would become encrypted with a key that is owned by the attacker. So your machine would become encrypted, it would slow down, and this is an example of CryptoLocker, a form of ransomware that would pop up on your screen. And you wouldn't be able to do anything else on that machine anymore unless you interacted with this screen. And basically what it's asking you to do is to acquire Bitcoin, which is an anonymous payment method. And to make payment, in this case, it's asking you to send 2 Bitcoins to that address, which is that series of letters and numbers. And it's telling you that your data is going to be destroyed in the next 48 hours, and they even have a countdown timer for you. So the idea is, from the attacker's standpoint, what they're trying to do is hold your data at ransom, hence the name ransomware. They're holding your data at ransom. You cannot access it anymore. It's encrypted with a key only they know, and they're telling you that if you want to get your data back, pay us in Bitcoins, and then we'll release the data back to you. Now, most of the time I get the question of, well, Jared, if I pay this ransom, are they really going to release the data back to me? And the answer is most likely yes. From everything that we've seen, and I've worked with local FBI regional field offices, and that's the case. They really do release the data back to you because they want you to be a repeat customer. To be quite frank, they know that if people, if word gets out that they don't actually release the data back, then people are less likely to pay it, and they'll just deal with trying to restore data or starting all over. So they really do release the data back. I guess one advantage, if you want to call it that, for the person that gets infected is that most of the time the attacker doesn't know who they're dealing with. They don't know if it's a home PC with not much data on it, or if it's, you know, a critical server in your EHR environment. They typically won't know this. So they don't know what kind of data they're necessarily holding at ransom. They just know they're holding it ransom. So you know, obviously it's worse if they know you're a big institution with deep pockets. They're going to ask for more money to do it, but most of the time they don't know who you are. So you certainly don't want to do anything that would, you know, give away, you know, who you are. In most cases, you're not communicating with them, but hopefully they don't figure out, you know, they're dealing with some big health system. So that's what it does. So the, you know, the threat here is, you know, you could lose your data. You know, the other option is don't pay it and just get rid of that machine, rebuild it, but you've lost all your data. So if it's something that's not important, then maybe that's your best course of action. But you know, this is something that gets debated, but it's my opinion, if the machine had PHI on it and this malware encrypts it, you don't know what's happening with that data. Someone else has access to your data, and I consider that a compromise of PHI. So I think that, you know, if it's over 500 records, it needs to be reported OCR. I think it should be treated like any other breach. Certainly it's going to cause service disruption if this is delivering medications or drugs to patients. You know, maybe it's a server that issues drugs, then and it's tied to a biomedical device. You could have, you know, patient disruption. You can't service your patients because of this, and certainly financial loss if it's a large amount of money as well. So, you know, good things to do here to thwart this this threat is good vulnerability management, good content filters and malware. Probably the most important is security awareness, though. Usually this comes in the form of phishing, and this is something that people click on and accidentally download, install on the machine, and then it also goes out to other machines, you know, does that pivoting, tries to infect other machines on the network. And certainly security awareness is a huge factor in making sure you don't get this installed. But of course, you know, data backups and having business continuity plans in place for when it does happen is critical, and cybersecurity insurance as well. Perhaps you can lean on that if you do choose to make a payment. So that's definitely number one. Number two is just general phishing, and what's been called to as business email compromise recently is not a fancy or highly technical scam. It's simply just someone that gets access, usually to a webmail console, where they can impersonate impersonate or spoof an email, you know, from CFO to controller or from CEO to CFO. Someone that's dealing with the transfer of information, or someone that would be in charge of wiring money. And basically, you know, they wait until the CFO's on vacation and they spoof that email and say, hey, you know, we need to get, you know, $200,000 out, needs to go to this location, and please do it right away. And if there's not good process controls or good communication between folks in the financial area, unfortunately, people send the money. And unless you notify the FBI right away, which there is a small, very small window where a wire can be reversed, most of the time it ends up going out. And in the US, there's been over 14,000 victims and well over 3 billion worldwide in simply people asking for money and fooling people into making bad decisions just by spoofing a simple email and sending that information out. So, you know, email filtering is part of the process, but that's, you know, that's always just, you know, filling a gap that's going to open up somewhere else. So, you know, there are technical email filtering controls. That's kind of a standard IT control that needs to be in place. More importantly, though, it's, you know, maybe limiting some social media. If you're in a high level position, you know, don't announce you're going on vacation, things of that nature. And security awareness training, like I already mentioned, making people become more aware to pick up on the red flags. A lot of times, you know, that email just has one letter off from the sender, and if someone doesn't pick up on that, it's easy to be overlooked. So certainly be aware of those phishing emails that come in, specifically in the financial department. Number 3 top threat is third-party vendors. Obviously, especially in healthcare, many third-party vendors are in play where you're providing tons of data to this vendor, you know, perhaps huge reports with patient information or financial information about the entity. to an outside provider. And a lot of times, it's not the main entity that gets breached, it's that third-party vendor that is utilizing your data that you've given out. A good example of this that everyone knows about is, it's non-healthcare, but it's Target, right? Everyone remembers the Target breach, and they remember the impact on that, and people got fired, and obviously tons of money paid out because of the Target breach. But what some people don't realize is that the initial breach happened, the initial point of entry in the Target breach was not Target, but it was an HVAC vendor that Target utilizes. It was a vendor that controlled the heating and air conditioning for many of Target's stores. Target obviously had a lot of fault too, because although this third-party company had access to the network, they certainly should have had access to the point-of-sale terminals all the way down to that network. So there were a lot of issues there, but the initial point of entry wasn't Target, it was their third party. And it was a company that no one's ever heard of the name of, and probably doesn't on this call, Fazio Mechanical Services. They're actually still around, but the point is, even though you're not the initial point of entry, even if it's a third party, if you're the big name, if you're the deep pocket, you're going to be the one that really needs to respond to the risk, and is really at the most risk in that situation. So make sure you have a very good vendor management system. Make sure procurement is identifying especially technical vendors that are going to have electronic transmissions of your data, because you need to review those vendors ahead of time and make that part of your decision-making process, making sure that you're only dealing with vendors that are going to protect data just as well as you. Moving on, biomedical devices, kind of in the same thread. Huge challenge for healthcare that's quite different than a lot of other industries is, it's one thing to secure traditional IT systems. It's a completely another world to try to secure the biomedical devices that are these hybrid. It's kind of like a computer, but it's also very much a healthcare delivery system. How do we protect that? And this is a new challenge that healthcare is dealing with now that, if it's an organization that has the basic blocking and tackling in place from an IT infrastructure standpoint, they're turning their attention to the biomedical devices, because certainly service interruption, loss EPHI, spread of malware, that's what these devices are getting known as. And the best way to respond to this threat is through network segmentation. It's making sure that they are on a separate, essentially untrusted network from everything else. And that way, if there's any issues, the problem is contained on a separate network, especially because many of these devices, once they get purchased, the vendor will not allow updates. There's controls in place by the FDA that say it needs to run this particular operating system with these updates, and a lot of times they don't allow you to update them. So you need to make sure that they're segmented off and dealt with separately. The fifth is a people issue. You may say, yes, Jared, this is a huge problem for me, and we've had an open position for security officer for 16 months, and we can't find the right person, especially if you're in a rural area. And because cybersecurity has become such a huge risk for everyone, the demand for IT security professionals has gone through the roof. So a lot of folks are trying to find the right people, but just can't identify the person because there's more market than talent can fill. So, many institutions, colleges, universities now are starting to push out, not just IT professionals, but IT security professionals, and that's great. But they're just now really entering the marketplace for a job, and they're highly in demand. So because of that, if you don't have the right skill set in place, obviously you're going to have insufficient control, potentially undetected breaches. You may have the technology, but you don't have the right person watching that technology, and it's just really hard to stay current. So, ways to counter this is internal promotion and training. I've seen folks, take someone from the IT department, maybe they were a database administrator before, and they send them to training, and they go out and get a certification, do everything they can to kind of educate themselves and fall into that role, which sometimes does work great because they already know the general IT infrastructure and just can apply security to that. Of course, if you want to be the top bidder, you can find a headhunter, but you're going to pay for it. You may lure someone over, but people with good IT security backgrounds are acquiring, large sums of money to change positions. Another option is a virtual information security officer. I actually am in this role for a couple of my clients where on a as needed as well as a temporary basis, I operate as a virtual information security officer. So not on site every day, but I'm leaned on and my team's leaned on to provide those services. So Crow and others can help you out from that perspective as well. All right, next up is poll question number 2.
For our second polling question, who is in charge of your cybersecurity program? We have a CISO or security officer and security team. It is a shared responsibility in IT. We contract or outsource our security program, or nobody. And again, as a reminder for those of you obtaining CPE certificates for today, you must respond to at least 2/3 of the polling questions. I'll give everyone just a little bit longer to respond to that before I close that polling question. Okay, we have about 96% that's voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close that, and I will share those results. Jared, 64% have a CISO, security officer, or security team in place. 27% say it is a shared responsibility in IT. 5% contract or outsource their security program, and 5% do not have anyone in place.
Great, thank you. So, yeah, pretty typical results. Certainly shared responsibility in IT always kind of stands out. But I think you got to move away from that. I think it needs to be, a primary job responsibility for someone to really own that and give it the dedication that it needs. So very interesting. All right, as I mentioned before, we were going to talk a little bit about compliance versus security. So compliance is different than security because it's essentially a legal checklist, right? For example, you can be very compliant but not secure. So from a HIPAA standpoint, you could have done all the right things. You could have had your HIPAA security risk assessments. You can have an action plan. But unless that really comes to fruition and you're making progress towards that plan, that's all it is just being compliant. OCR may audit you and see that you've done a risk assessment and see that you have a plan in place, and hopefully I think they're going to start moving towards seeing people make progress against that plan. But nonetheless, you can be compliant, but it's really not necessarily going to mean that you're secure. And certainly we've seen the impact of this because the headlines don't disappear, right? I mean, every day there's something new about a new breach or hacking attempt or loss of data that is impacting all of us. So despite all the compliance that's out there in healthcare and the financial services industry, things aren't slowing down. So I think the focus really needs to be on being secure and not just compliant as we move forward. Which kind of brings us to the next topic, what is the cybersecurity strategy that you have? And these two pictures, I think, represent two ways of looking at it. And on the left side, you see the picture of a lock and around some network cables. And this picture honestly drives me nuts. Any marketing material that is coming from a cybersecurity professional or company with a product, they always like putting that lock on there, but I don't like what that lock represents because it represents that you can fix the problem. I think that's mentally what people take away is like, oh, if I buy this solution or if I buy this product, I can finally find that perfect lock where I can lock my systems up, check that box, and we can move on. But that's just not how things work in the cybersecurity world. It's an ongoing risk. And that's really what the chess player represents here. It's got to be a game you learn. It's got to be a game you're good at, and it has to be a game that you continue to play long term. You can't just put a lock on it and move on. So hopefully your strategy is not finding the right solution because there is no silver bullet. It just has to be something that becomes your ongoing operations and culture. So who's in charge of this strategy? That's sometimes the next question, right? You may be thinking, okay, I'm convinced I need a good strategy that's ongoing, but who leads it? It's the IT guy, right? Because that's who's doing it today. Well, management still regards cybersecurity predominantly a technology issue rather than a business issue. And that's a big problem because, as I mentioned before, it's not just technology, right? It's people and processes. It's that culture. You could try to filter the emails out. You can try to protect people from clicking on things, but at the end of the day, the people can work around those technical controls. The technical controls can't do everything. So you must identify who's leading the initiative that can get everyone on the same page, gain support for management, and really push out a holistic strategy that includes people, process, and technology controls, and be able to communicate that all the way back up to the board as far as tracking progress month to month and year to year. And a typical implementation is going to look something like this. If you don't have a security function, establishing that security role, and as I said before, assigning that primary responsibility for IT security. Find out who's going to lead the charge. And they can be in IT, but the point is that it has to start from the top, and they have to have support of the organization to push this out. And they do that by doing number 2 here, identifying, documenting the IT security governance, the policies and procedures, the gospel everyone's going to live by, and making sure that is supported by the board and that they're going to do it as well. Nothing is worse than high-level management that wants to be an exception to the rule everyone else has to follow to. So you need that top-level support. You need to implement the cybersecurity controls, so process and technology controls to prevent, detect, and respond to attacks. Then the people controls. You need to do that security awareness. You need to make sure you're training and testing folks through maybe monthly phishing simulations to train them what that looks like, or train them through a process. And then, like I said before, the cultural aspect, the continual assessment and improvement to make sure that, at least on an annual basis, you can leverage that HIPAA risk assessment to reassess yourself, figure out where your top risks are, and then refocus to make sure that you're wholly focused on the top risks and not just other risks. So that takes us to question number 3.
Our third polling question is, how well do you feel you have minimized your cybersecurity risk? We have a very mature cybersecurity program. We have the basics, but there is room for improvement. We are at more risk than I feel comfortable with, or I don't have the data to be able to respond. And again, just a reminder for those of you looking for CPE certificates, you must respond to at least 2/3 of the polling questions. Looks like we have 96% voted, which has been pretty typical on all the questions. So I'm going to go ahead and close that and share the results with you, Jared. 41% say they have a very mature cybersecurity program. 41% say they have the basics, but there's room for improvement. And 9% say they are at more risk than they feel comfortable with, as well as 9% saying they don't have the data to be able to respond.
Great. Well, almost half feel like they have a very mature cybersecurity program. That's great to see. Hopefully you continue to get the support from top-level management to continue to grow that. That's certainly higher than what we've seen is, even 2 years ago. It's usually, maybe they had a program, but it wasn't very mature, so it's good to see a big percentage there. We have the basics. I think that's where most of us feel comfortable responding, saying, yeah, I know I have a long password. I know that much, right? They're always asking me to create a more complex password and change it more often. So you have the basics there, but certainly always room for improvement. The 9% have more risk than you feel comfortable with. Let's talk. I think there's certainly ways where we can open the eyes to get the support that you need to get to where you feel like you're more like the folks that fall in through B or A, and you certainly can improve. Don't feel like you can't get better from where you're at. So let's talk about that. Getting better, whether you're mature or not. Here's something to think about as far as reevaluating where you are and making sure you have a good action plan in place. Step 1, understand your data assets. So the biggest thing I tell folks is don't focus on the technology first. I'm a technology guy, and like most folks, we like our gadgets, but you can't start at the technology. You have to start with the data. So get serious about your data asset management. It's not fun, but you have to do it first. You have to figure out, what is the data we care about? Maybe you're not a provider. Maybe you're some other business associate, or you're a vendor to a provider, so you're signing all these BAA contracts, but you don't even know why you're doing that or what they say. It all boils down to the data anyway, so figure out what's your important data and figure out where it's at. So you want to make sure, what role that data has in your overall operations. And the biggest thing is that the problem is data is not just in your data center anymore. It's all kinds of different places. So that takes me to, step 2 is mapping out the data stores and flows of your data. So once you identify the type of data you have, the next question is, where is all that data going? We know it's not in the data center anymore. It's going out over email, it's on mobile devices, it's in the cloud, we have offline backups, it's going to vendors, file shares, you name it. I like to say you can't dream up where your data ends up, so you must follow the data. So step 1, figure out what's your critical data. Step 2, figure out where all your data goes. And here's an example of that. This is a very example, would be a very small entity, right? But look at all the different data flows here, especially when you have data go to a vendor, which then goes to another vendor. So you got the vendor of a vendor. It's very important to know, to track all that information down. It's one thing to keep your house clean, but managing all those different vendors and all these different transmissions and different people that are involved can get very complicated very quick. So getting that foundational step of where all your data goes and really understanding that is truly a critical step. Step 3, assess your cybersecurity controls, right? So as part of your HIPAA risk assessment, you can take it to the next level. So if you're looking to become more mature, NIST, who I mentioned before, has pushed out a cybersecurity framework, and this has become the framework that everyone has been drawing to, and it's also endorsed by the American Hospital Association. And essentially what it is, it breaks controls down into these 5 categories of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So many different controls that fit underneath those 5 buckets, but essentially you assess yourself by rating across these different tier levels, all the way from tier 1 partial to tier 4 adaptive. So there's set definitions for that, and you can rate yourself across all these different subcategories. And from there, you can figure out, where your biggest gaps are. And I like to compare the maturity versus the effort it takes to mature it. So if you're trying, you have a top risk, maybe you have lots of gaps. Well, where do you start? Well, you focus on the ones that are going to take the least amount of resistance to get there. So maybe it's just a change in configuration versus something where it's a new process the whole organization has to abide to. So doing this type of control assessment will identify where your gaps are and your top risks. Once you do that, step 4 is to test your controls. So let's say for those folks that were the 41% that have a mature cybersecurity program, maybe you're at this point now where you need to simulate a hack. You feel like you can detect a control, you would know you have a breach. Well, let's prove it, right? Let's simulate a real-world hack. And this is called penetration testing, where you can hire an outside person, or if you have the skill set to do it in-house, you should do this on a quarterly basis. Have someone attack your network. Let's see if the devices light up and the alarms go off and IT is aware, and not only aware, but how do they react to it? How does the organization come together and react to it? You can have a very real-life exercise to identify where your weakest points may be and get recommendations on how to improve the gaps that are found. So let's say you go through all those steps. Board communication is like I said, you need to have that support from the top. And one thing to keep in mind, the reason I love this graph is that you can't be perfect. We mentioned that before. There's no lock you can put in place. You can never be perfect. Chase Bank puts more money into their cybersecurity program than anyone else, and they still get breached. So you can't be perfect, unfortunately, but you can bring your risk down. You can have the target here of achieving that reasonable and appropriate level of risk. And this is what you want to have with your board, is you want them to understand that you're not in that liability zone, you're right on that compliance line, and you're doing enough to bring things reasonable and appropriate. And if you get to that target, and it's going to be different for each organization based on the resources available to you, but if you can get to that maturity level, that's where you want to be, because you're going to deter most attacks to someone else, because you're going to have appropriate controls in place and hopefully not be the target of an attacker. All right, almost done, but we'll stop there and we'll do polling question number 4.
Thank you, Jared. This is our final polling question. Have you had a cybersecurity incident before? We have had no incidents. We have had one incident, but it was not public. We have had a public incident listed on OCR Naughty List. And again, just a final reminder for those of you who are hoping to obtain CPE certificates for today, you must respond to at least 2/3 of the polling questions. We have 95% voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close that and share with you, Jared. 52% have had no incidents, 33% have had one, but it was not public, and 14% have had a public incident.
Very good. Well, that's about half the group, right? So half of us have had something, whether it be public or not. And sometimes people ask me, what's the OCR Naughty List? Well, if you don't know, essentially, if you have a breach of 500 or more records, you're supposed to report it to the OCR, and you make a list. So you can actually go out there and search for an organization and see, who's had a breach. And it's not just seeing who's had a breach, though. What's interesting about that data, if you do visit the list, is that you can see, kind of what was compromised and the realm that it was compromised in. And you'll see a lot of the times it's stolen hardware, and I think in this case they're not targeting healthcare. They just saw a MacBook in the back of a car and they wanted to steal the hardware. But unfortunately, the result of that is if there's records on there, the records are considered compromised, can be considered compromised depending on encryption controls and other things that could be in place. So point being here, again, if you haven't had an incident yet, you may in the future. And that takes me to essentially the last section here of incident response planning. Be prepared for that. A lot of organizations don't have a plan or a breach response action plan to figure out what they're going to do when something's going to be breached. Who are you going to work with? What are the laws? What will customers ask? What will the OCR say? What do you do? The last thing you want to do is be scrambling in the wake of a breach trying to figure out these different questions. So, in fact, what's interesting about Primera, why I put this on here, is they built this website, just to talk about a breach that they had, and a lot of folks are doing just that. They're creating websites ahead of time, with the CEO, with a script, talking about how they're sorry this happened and what they're going to do about it and why it happened and all those sorts of things before a breach even happens. So for the half of the folks that haven't had a breach yet, you should still be working on this. You should still be ready to this level so that you're in control of the message, when something happens. The last thing you want to do is have the media take control of it or look like you don't know what you're doing at that point. You want to be as prepared as you can. All right, well, as we wrap up, kind of the key takeaways from today, making sure you understand that, everyone's a target. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways in. No matter who you are, what you're doing, you're a potential target for a cybersecurity attack. Number two, know where your data lives. Start with the data. Don't think about technology first. Make sure you know what data is critical to you and where it goes. Assess that and mitigate to a reasonable level. Test those controls if you're a mature organization. Don't start with the testing. Don't do a pen test if you're an immature program. You're just going to prove what you already know. Sometimes people need that to gain attention and support, but most of the time you really shouldn't do that testing until you feel like you've mitigated to a reasonable level. And then, like I just said, be prepared to respond to that breach. So have the good controls, test those controls, but always be prepared to respond and have it be part of your culture. As we talked about, there's no silver bullet for this. You really have to just have that as part of your everyday going. Make sure you have someone leading the charge and maturing the program on an ongoing basis, because the risks today are going to be different than the risks next week. And with that, I'll take any questions at this point. If anyone has any questions, or my information is available on the screen, you can reach out to me in a variety of ways, or simply just leave your email in the messaging section, and I can reach back out to you with any particulars around what we discussed today, unique situation you have, our services, or anything else that you would like to discuss. I'd be happy to do that.
So Jared, while we wait to see if any questions come through, obviously just want to thank you for joining us today. Very great information and appreciate having you. For those of you who do have questions, in the interest of time, if you don't want to ask now, as Jared said, his contact information is all there, or you can place your email address and your contact information in the chat box, which I can get to him. Or if you do have questions that you would like to ask of Jared for the group to hear, feel free to put those in the chat box as well, and I can relay those to the group. Jared, I don't see anything coming through yet, so I'm going to assume we don't have any questions that they want to ask of the group. So again, his slides are available on our website, tnhfma.org, and his contact information is there at the end of the presentation as well. So with that, I will thank you again, Jared, and we will end the webinar.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.